Jack Carter didn't know why he was standing there. The grand hall of the alien kingdom stretched before him, massive pillars reaching up into a sky of deep violet. Alien nobles, warriors, and dignitaries filled the chamber, their colorful robes and battle-worn armor shimmering under the golden light of the hovering orbs above. The air was thick with tension, but Jack wasn't sure why, until he saw her. At the center of the raised platform stood the princess. She was small, delicate by the standards of her own people, barely reaching Jack's chest. Her luminous silver eyes darted across the gathered warriors, searching, waiting. She wore a flowing deep blue robe, embroidered with ancient symbols that Jack didn't understand. A ceremonial headdress of thin metal strands framed her face, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. Despite her regal posture, there was something unmistakable in her expression. Fear. The elder, a towering figure with dark, leathery skin and piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward. His deep voice echoed through the chamber. "The princess requires a champion," he declared, "a warrior to stand by her side, to defend her against all who seek to claim her throne through blood and betrayal." Jack glanced around at the gathered warriors, battle-hardened soldiers from all corners of the kingdom. They stood stiff, their faces unreadable. He expected them to step forward, to fight for the honor of protecting their princess. But no one moved. Silence. Not a single warrior stepped forward. Some lowered their gazes, others shifted uncomfortably. A few even smirked, exchanging glances as if the very idea was laughable. Jack frowned. Something was wrong. The princess swallowed, her hands tightening into fists. She took a slow breath and lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the weight of rejection pressing down on her. "Is there no one?" she asked. Her voice, though soft, carried through the hall. It was a question not just to the warriors, but to the kingdom itself. Still, no answer. Jack exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't sure what was happening here, but he could recognize cruelty when he saw it. The way they all ignored her, the way they averted their eyes. It wasn't out of fear or hesitation. It was deliberate. They didn't want to stand by her. She wasn't just without a champion. She was undesirable. Jack had seen a lot of things in his time. Wars, betrayals, desperate people clinging to the last shreds of hope. And he had a rule: never get involved. He was just a human, a wandering mercenary who had stumbled into this kingdom after his ship crashed in the Outer Rim. He had no business here. But something about the way they looked at her, the way they refused her, made something in him snap. Before he could stop himself, he took a step forward. "I'll do it," he said. The moment the words left his mouth, the hall erupted. Laughter, scoffs, murmurs of disbelief. Some of the warriors sneered openly. A few nobles exchanged shocked glances, as if unable to comprehend what they had just heard. The elder stared down at him, eyes narrowing. "A human." One of the warriors spat. "You think you have the right to stand beside her?" Jack crossed his arms. "I don't see anyone else stepping up." The warrior took a step toward him, his towering frame casting a shadow over Jack. His dark green skin shimmered under the lights, his golden eyes burning with contempt. "You don't understand, Offworlder. This isn't just about fighting. The one who stands with her bears her fate." His lips curled into a smirk. "And no warrior here is willing to die for that." Jack's stomach tightened. Die for that? His gaze flicked back to the princess. She wasn't looking at the warriors anymore. She was staring directly at him. Her silver eyes held something strange. Not hope, not gratitude. Warning. Jack hesitated. Maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe he should have kept his mouth shut. But it was too late now. He had spoken. He had stepped forward. And no matter how reckless it was, he wasn't about to back down in front of these smug, self-important aliens. The elder studied him for a long moment before turning to the princess. "Do you accept this human as your champion?" A long silence filled the hall. Jack could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The princess didn't answer immediately. She watched him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I accept," she said. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The warriors exchanged stunned looks, a few of them whispering urgently among themselves. Jack had the feeling that something irreversible had just happened, something that could not be undone. The elder's gaze flickered, just for a second, before he raised his hand. "So be it," Jack exhaled, trying to ignore the growing unease in his gut. He wasn't sure what he had just signed up for, but judging by the way everyone was looking at him now, like a man marked for death, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a royal duty. It was a curse. Jack didn't sleep that night. The air in his chamber was thick with unease. The walls were made of smooth, dark stone, lined with intricate golden carvings of past rulers. A soft blue glow pulsed from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the room. It was meant to be a place of rest, but Jack felt anything but safe. His mind replayed the events of the day. The rejection of the princess. The silence of the warriors. The way they had all looked at him when he stepped forward. He had seen pity in their eyes. Pity for him. Like he was already dead. He turned onto his side, staring at the door. Something wasn't right. Why hadn't anyone stepped forward for her? It wasn't just politics. There was fear. Deep, gut-wrenching fear. And then there was the princess herself. She had barely spoken to him after accepting him as her champion. She had only met his gaze once before the ceremony ended, her silver eyes holding something strange. Guilt. Jack let out a slow breath, rubbing his face. Maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe he should have just kept his mouth shut and walked away. A sharp noise cut through the silence. Jack's body went still. He listened, heart pounding. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was outside his chamber. He sat up carefully, reaching for the blade he had tucked under his pillow. His fingers closed around the hilt just as the door slid open. Jack moved fast. In a heartbeat, he was on his feet, weapon raised, only to freeze as he saw her. The princess. She stood in the doorway, her small frame illuminated by the dim hallway lights. Her deep blue robe shimmered, loose strands of her silver hair falling over her shoulders. She wasn't wearing her ceremonial headdress anymore. Without it, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Jack lowered his blade, exhaling sharply. "You shouldn't sneak up on people like that." Veera hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I had to make sure you were still alive." Jack frowned. "Why wouldn't I be?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced around the room, as if checking for something. Then she turned back to him, her voice lower now. "You don't understand what you've done, human." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Then explain it to me." Veera hesitated again. Then, after a moment, she stepped closer, lowering her voice even more. "They didn't reject me because they didn't want to protect me," she said. "They rejected me because anyone who stands with me dies." A cold sensation spread through Jack's chest. "What do you mean?" She swallowed, her fingers tightening at her sides. "There is a curse on my bloodline," she said, "a death that follows those who stand at my side. My father, my brother, every warrior who has ever sworn loyalty to me is dead." Jack's grip on his weapon tightened. "Dead how?" he asked carefully. Veera's gaze flickered. "Some were killed in battle, some by assassination, some by things unseen." Jack exhaled slowly. That explained a lot. The warriors, the nobles, the fear. It wasn't just about protecting her. It was about surviving her. "And you accepted me knowing this?" he asked. Veera looked away. "I thought maybe, just maybe, you would be different." Jack studied her. There was something in her voice, something fragile, desperate. She had known no one would step forward for her. She had known she was alone. He had been a last resort. He shook his head. "Well, it's a little late for second thoughts now, princess." Her silver eyes darted back to him. You can still walk away." Jack let out a dry chuckle. "And let them all be right about me." He shook his head. "No thanks." Veera stared at him for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "You should keep your door locked tonight." Jack frowned. "Why?" A distant sound echoed through the halls, a scraping, like metal on stone. Veera tensed. "Because you won't be the only one fighting to stay alive." Jack didn't get the chance to ask what she meant. The lights in his chamber flickered. The temperature in the room dropped. And then, the door behind Veera exploded inward. Jack barely had time to react. He grabbed Veera and pulled her down just as a dark, jagged blade sliced through the air where her head had been. A massive figure in black armor stepped through the broken doorway, eyes glowing red beneath a heavy mask. An assassin. Jack moved fast. He shoved Veera aside and rolled forward, his blade flashing as he met the assassin's strike. Metal clashed against metal. Sparks flew. The force of the impact nearly sent Jack sprawling, but he held his ground. The assassin didn't hesitate. He struck again, each movement precise, deadly. Jack barely dodged in time. Whoever this was, they weren't just some hired killer. They were trained. Veera scrambled back, her breath coming fast. "They're already here," she whispered. Jack grit his teeth, blocking another vicious strike. "You think?" The assassin feinted left, then suddenly shifted, twisting toward Veera. Jack's heart stopped. He reacted purely on instinct, throwing himself in front of her. The blade sliced across his shoulder, pain searing through him. He grunted but didn't fall. Instead, he grabbed the assassin's wrist and wrenched it aside. Then he drove his knee into the attacker's ribs. The assassin staggered back. Jack didn't wait. He grabbed his blade with both hands and plunged it forward. The steel met flesh. The assassin stiffened. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the figure collapsed, the glow in his eyes flickering out. Jack exhaled heavily, gripping his bleeding shoulder. Veera stared at him, wide-eyed. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow. "So, princess," he muttered, "you were saying something about a curse." Veera didn't laugh. She didn't smile. Instead, she looked toward the shattered doorway. Because there, standing in the dimly lit hall, were 3 more figures. More assassins. Jack's jaw tightened. Yeah, he was definitely in trouble. Jack barely had a second to react before the assassins rushed forward. The air grew thick with the scent of burning metal as their blades gleamed in the dim light, each one aiming straight for him. His body screamed from the wound on his shoulder, but he didn't have time to dwell on the pain. If he slowed down, he was dead. If he hesitated, Veera was dead. The first assassin lunged, his blade cutting the air with a sharp whistle. Jack twisted to the side, barely dodging before slamming his elbow into the attacker's ribs. The impact sent a sharp vibration through his arm, but the assassin barely flinched. The second assassin was already on him, swinging wide. Jack ducked, the blade missing his head by inches, and rolled backward. "Veera, get behind me," he barked. She didn't need to be told twice. The princess scrambled behind him, clutching the folds of her robe. Her silver eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering lights like twin mirrors. Jack tightened his grip on his blade. The assassins moved in unison, their movements eerily silent, calculating. They weren't just random mercenaries. They were trained killers, ones who had done this before. And Jack was just one man. The third assassin struck. Jack barely parried in time, his muscles burning from the force of the blow. He pushed back hard, throwing the attacker off balance, but the others were already closing in. Too fast, too many. He wasn't going to last long like this. His mind raced. He needed an opening, a way to even the odds. His eyes flicked to the broken pieces of the chamber door. Wood, splintered, sharp edges. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jack suddenly dropped to the floor, rolling toward the scattered debris. The assassins hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to grab a jagged wooden shard. He twisted back up, hurling it with all his strength. The shard slammed into the visor of the nearest assassin. The killer let out a choked sound, stumbling back, and Jack didn't waste a second. He surged forward, driving his blade into the distracted assassin's chest. The enemy gasped, jerking in shock before collapsing. Two left, but they didn't seem shaken. If anything, they seemed calmer. Jack's stomach twisted. Why weren't they backing down? Then he noticed the way their heads tilted slightly, not toward him, but toward Veera. Realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't here for him. "Princess, move," he shouted. Veera flinched, but it was already too late. One of the assassins threw a dagger. Jack saw it too late. He lunged, but the blade was already spinning toward Veera. The princess gasped. Then suddenly, something strange happened. The air around her rippled. A deep, thrumming pulse echoed through the chamber as the dagger slowed. The metal trembled, hovering inches from her chest, before it suddenly dropped to the floor, harmless. Jack's breath caught. What the? Veera stared at the fallen dagger, just as stunned as he was. The assassins, however, weren't stunned at all. They were angry. They moved faster now, their strikes more vicious, more desperate. Jack barely managed to deflect their blows, his blade clashing against theirs in a flurry of sparks. He was running out of strength. His arms ached, his vision blurred from the blood loss. If this kept up, another dagger flashed toward him. Jack twisted, but he was too slow. The blade slashed across his ribs, burning hot as it cut through his skin. He gritted his teeth, staggering back. This was it. He wasn't going to make it. Then Veera stepped forward. Jack barely had time to react before a sudden shockwave erupted from her. The air shimmered like heat off a desert floor. The remaining assassins jerked back, their bodies thrown off balance by the unseen force. One of them was flung backward entirely, slamming into the far wall with a sickening crunch. Jack turned, staring at the princess. Her hands were trembling. Her silver eyes were wide, filled with something between terror and awe. It was clear she hadn't meant to do that. The last assassin hesitated, just for a moment, but it was long enough for Jack to finish it. He didn't give the enemy a chance to recover. With a final desperate burst of energy, he lunged forward, driving his blade deep into the last assassin's chest. The figure let out a choked sound before collapsing. Silence. Jack staggered back, panting. Blood dripped from his wounds, pooling at his feet. His entire body ached. Every inch of him screamed for rest. Veera stared at him, then at the fallen assassins, then at her own hands. She swallowed hard. I didn't know I could do that. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. Yeah, well, good timing. He turned toward the bodies. These weren't just some random thugs, he muttered. They knew what they were doing. He glanced at her. And they knew about you. Veera hesitated, then slowly nodded. They came because of my bloodline, she whispered. Because of whatever I am. Jack wasn't sure what to say to that. He barely understood what had happened. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. A heavy pounding sound echoed through the hallway outside. Shouts rang out. The palace guards. Jack exhaled. Let me guess. They're going to think I did this. Veera winced. Probably. Jack sighed, rolling his shoulders despite the pain. Great. Just what I needed. The princess hesitated before stepping closer. For the first time, she looked at him not with fear, but with something else. Something like trust. They won't listen to me, she said quietly. But I think you're the only one I can trust now. Jack looked at her. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then he let out a short, tired chuckle. Well, princess, looks like we're both in deep now. The guards were almost at the door. Jack tightened his grip on his weapon, his body screaming in protest. This was only the beginning. Jack had seen a lot of bad situations before. He'd fought in bar brawls on backwater planets, escaped from mercenaries who wanted him dead, and even survived a crash landing in enemy territory. But standing in a blood-stained chamber with 3 dead assassins at his feet and the sound of palace guards rushing toward him, this was a whole new level of bad. Veera was already backing away from the door, her silver eyes darting between him and the bodies. The flickering lights above cast a ghostly glow on her face, making her look even smaller than she already was. Jack knew one thing for sure. If the guards saw this, they wouldn't stop to ask questions. "They're almost here," she whispered. Jack wiped the blood from his brow, his heart pounding. He didn't have time to think. Instinct took over. He grabbed Veera's wrist and yanked her toward the far side of the room, where a long, narrow window stretched across the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than waiting to be arrested, or worse, executed. "Come on," he muttered. She hesitated, glancing at the heavy wooden doors that rattled under the force of the guards slamming against them. The thick beams wouldn't hold for long. "You're really going to jump out a window?" she asked, her voice breathless. Jack glanced at her. "Unless you've got a better idea, princess." She bit her lip, then nodded. Jack didn't waste another second. He slammed his elbow against the window, shattering the fragile pane. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of burning torches and distant city streets. He didn't bother checking how far the drop was. He didn't have the luxury. The doors behind them burst open. Jack turned just in time to see a wave of heavily armored guards storm into the room, weapons drawn. Their dark eyes landed on the bodies first, then on him. "Stop him," one of them roared. Jack grabbed Veera and jumped. For a split second, they were weightless. The wind howled around them, the golden palace lights flashing past in a blur. Then they hit the water below. The impact sent a shock through Jack's body, cold and sharp. The deep canal swallowed them instantly, pulling them beneath the surface. Jack kicked hard, dragging Veera upward. His lungs burned as they broke through the water, gasping for breath. Veera coughed, her small hands gripping his shirt. "You are insane." Jack grinned despite himself. "Yeah, well, we're not dead yet." Above them, the guards were shouting. Jack knew they didn't have much time before the palace forces spread through the city, looking for them. He grabbed Veera's arm again and pulled her toward the shadows of a stone bridge, where they could catch their breath. She was shivering, her soaked robe clinging to her frame. Jack exhaled, shaking the water from his face. He needed a plan. Fast. "Where's the nearest safe place?" he asked. Veera hesitated, glancing around. "The lower districts. There's an old temple. No one goes there anymore." Jack nodded. "Then that's where we're going." They moved fast, slipping through the darkened streets. The city was alive with night markets and glowing lanterns, but Jack could feel the tension in the air. Every guard in the capital would be looking for them. Veera stayed close, her footsteps light, her breathing steady despite everything. He glanced at her. "You okay?" She nodded, though she didn't look at him. I never thought I'd be running from my own people." Jack didn't have an answer for that. He had been an outsider his whole life. No home, no loyalty to any planet or kingdom. But Veera belonged here, or at least she was supposed to. They reached the temple just before dawn. It was an old structure, its stone walls covered in vines, its archways cracked with time. Jack led her inside, his muscles aching from the fight, the chase, the cold. He finally let himself sit down. Veera sat across from him, hugging her knees to her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. Jack let out a breath. "Yeah, well, things rarely go the way we want." Silence stretched between them. The temple was quiet, the only sound coming from the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. Then, finally, she spoke again. "You saw what happened back there." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jack nodded. "Yeah." She lifted her hand, staring at her fingers as if they belonged to someone else. "I didn't know I could do that. I've never, Never stopped something in midair like that before. Jack leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Well, you did, and it probably saved your life. She let out a small, shaky laugh, or it made everything worse. Jack frowned. What do you mean? Veera swallowed, curling her fingers into a fist. I think that's what they were afraid of. He studied her, waiting. She finally met his gaze, her silver eyes glinting in the dim light. The assassins, the warriors, the entire court. They weren't afraid because I'm weak. She exhaled slowly. They were afraid because I'm not. Jack felt something cold settle in his gut. If that was true, if the real reason she had been rejected wasn't because she was small or insignificant, but because of what she could become, then things were worse than he thought. Before he could respond, a shadow passed over the temple entrance. Jack's hand went to his blade, his body tensing. Someone was outside. Veera saw it too. She shifted closer to him, her breath hitching. The footsteps were slow, careful. Not the heavy boots of palace guards, but something else. Jack moved silently, pressing himself against the stone wall. He signaled for Veera to stay back. She nodded, her small frame disappearing into the shadows. The figure stepped inside. Jack acted instantly, grabbing the intruder and slamming them against the wall, his blade at their throat. A low chuckle met his ears. Well now, the stranger murmured, that's no way to greet a friend. Jack narrowed his eyes. The man was tall, with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes. His clothing was different from the palace guards, worn, rugged, like someone who spent his life moving in the underworld of this city. Who the hell are you? Jack demanded. The stranger smirked. Someone who knows exactly who you are, Jack Carter. And more importantly, his gaze flicked to Veera, who was still hidden in the shadows. I know why they want her dead. Jack didn't move, his grip still firm. Start talking. The man tilted his head. Not here. Not yet. His voice was calm, confident, like he held all the answers. Jack hated people like that. The stranger's smirk widened. But if you really want to survive this, you're going to need me. Jack exhaled slowly. He didn't trust this guy. But he also knew one thing for certain. They were out of options. Jack didn't let go of the man's collar. His blade was still pressed against the stranger's throat, but the man didn't flinch. He just stood there, his smirk unwavering, as if he knew Jack wouldn't do it. And that irritated Jack more than anything. Talk, Jack growled, or you're leaving this temple in pieces. The man tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. You're quick to pull a blade, human, but you might want to hear what I have to say before you start making messes. Jack pushed harder. I'm listening. The stranger let out a slow breath, as if deciding how much to reveal. The assassins that came for you weren't just hired killers. They were sent by the High Council, the very people Veera is supposed to rule over. Jack's grip tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. Veera, who had been standing just out of sight, finally stepped forward. Her silver eyes were wary, but there was a fire in them now, one that hadn't been there before. Why? She asked. Why would my own council want me dead? The stranger let out a short laugh. Because they don't want you to sit on that throne. He flicked his gaze toward Jack. Your human friend already figured part of it out, didn't he? Jack didn't lower his weapon. They're afraid of her. The man nodded. Afraid of what she can do. Afraid of what she is. Veera stiffened. I don't even know what I am. The stranger's expression shifted slightly, just for a second, something that looked almost like pity. That, he said, is exactly why they want you gone. Jack finally let go, stepping back. The stranger straightened his tunic, rubbing his neck as if mildly annoyed by the whole ordeal. You're awfully calm for a guy who just had a blade to his throat, Jack muttered. The man shrugged. It's not the first time. He turned back to Veera. You need to leave the city. Veera's brows furrowed. Leave? Why? If I run, I'll never be able to reclaim my throne. The man sighed, as if he was explaining something to a stubborn child. That throne is a coffin waiting for you to sit in it. They don't need an army to get rid of you, princess. They just need patience. One way or another, if you return to the palace now, you will die. Jack crossed his arms. Then what's your solution? The stranger met his gaze. Find out the truth. You want to know why the council fears her. You want to know what she really is. Then you need to go to the ruins of Ivar. Veera's breath hitched. Jack noticed the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. That place is forbidden, she said. The ruins were sealed off generations ago. The man smirked. Exactly. And don't you think there's a reason for that? Jack exhaled. He was tired. His wounds ached. His body begged for rest. But he knew there was no stopping now. We'll go, he said, glancing at Veera. Unless you're afraid of breaking a few rules. Veera met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded. I'm tired of being afraid. The stranger grinned. Good answer. The journey to the ruins wasn't easy. They had to move carefully through the lower districts, avoiding the ever-present patrols sweeping through the city in search of them. The further they traveled, the more Jack noticed the unease in the air. People whispered behind closed doors, their gazes lingering too long when they passed by. The council had done more than send assassins. They had turned the entire city against her. By the time they reached the city's outskirts, the moons were high, casting pale light over the sprawling wastelands beyond the capital. The ruins of Ivar sat on the horizon, jagged spires of stone piercing the sky like broken teeth. Veera stood still for a long moment, staring at the ruins. I've never been here before, she admitted. My father always told me it was a cursed place. Jack rolled his shoulders. Yeah, well, we've already had a lot of bad luck lately. Might as well keep the streak going. The stranger, who had finally introduced himself as Kale, smirked. At least you have a sense of humor. You're going to need it. Jack wasn't sure he liked Kale. The guy was too relaxed, too smooth for someone tangled up in something this dangerous. But he knew things, and right now, they needed answers. They stepped into the ruins. The air was different here, thick, charged with something unseen. Jack felt it immediately, a strange prickling sensation along his skin, as if the air itself was alive. Veera must have felt it too, because she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. What is this place? Jack muttered. Kale knelt near an old stone pillar, running his fingers over the ancient carvings etched into its surface. The history of your people is built on lies, princess, he said without looking at her. Your ancestors weren't just rulers. They were something else. Veera stepped closer, staring at the symbols. I don't understand. Kale sighed. Your bloodline is not normal. You've felt it, haven't you? The way your body reacts to danger, the way your power surged back at the palace. That wasn't just instinct. Veera's fingers curled against the stone. Then what was it? Kale met her gaze. A warning. Jack frowned. A warning of what? Kale stood, dusting off his hands. That your power doesn't just belong to you. It's been locked away, suppressed for generations. But someone, or something, is waking it up. Veera's face paled. Jack took a step forward. And if it wakes up completely? Kale gave a slow, knowing smile. Then you'll see why the council fears her. A deep rumble echoed beneath their feet. Jack stiffened, his hand going to his blade. The air around them shifted, the very ground beneath them trembling. Dust and small rocks scattered as cracks formed along the ancient stone floor. Kale's smirk vanished. Well, he muttered, looks like we're about to find out. The ruins came alive. Columns of light erupted from the ground, twisting like serpents through the air. The carvings on the walls glowed, ancient symbols pulsing with a rhythm that made Jack's chest tighten. And then, a voice. Not from any of them, not from anywhere, but everywhere. Soft, echoing, ancient. She has come at last. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Veera's eyes widened. Who's there? The ruins trembled again, and then a figure emerged from the darkness. Jack's hand tightened around his blade, because whatever it wasn't human. The figure moved slowly, its form shifting in the pale light of the ruins. It wasn't fully solid, not in the way a person was. Instead, its shape seemed to flicker between shadows and substance, as if it existed halfway between worlds. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were deep pools of silver light, the same color as Veera's. Jack's instincts screamed at him to draw his weapon, but something about the presence of the being held him in place. He felt as if the very air had thickened, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Veera stood frozen, her lips slightly parted. Jack wasn't sure if it was fear, recognition, or something else entirely that kept her from speaking. Then the voice came again, not spoken aloud, but inside their minds. The lost daughter awakens. Veera shuddered, taking a half-step back. What are you? The being tilted its head, its form shifting like smoke caught in the wind. A memory, a guardian, a voice of what was forgotten. Jack clenched his fists. He didn't like riddles, and he didn't like anything that could mess with his head. And what exactly was forgotten? The being turned toward him. He felt an immense pressure settle over his mind, like 1,000 eyes watching him all at once. But it was curious, not hostile. The truth of her blood, the chains placed upon it, the fear that binds this world. Jack glanced at Veera. She was staring at the being, her silver eyes wide. He could see the gears turning in her head, the puzzle pieces starting to align. "They're afraid of me," she whispered, "because they know what I am." The being's gaze, or whatever it had in place of eyes, lingered on her. "They do not fear you, child. They fear what you will become." A cold shiver ran down Jack's spine. What does that mean? The ruins trembled again, dust cascading from the stone columns. The glow of the ancient carvings pulsed faster, like a heartbeat quickening. The being's form flickered, as if something was pulling it away. Veera's voice was steady now. "Tell me, what am I?" The being's shape solidified just long enough to whisper one final phrase. "The key to the end. The beginning of the storm." Then it was gone. A sudden silence crashed down over the ruins. Jack let out a slow breath, flexing his fingers. His body felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted. But the tension in his chest remained. Kale was the first to break the silence. He let out a low whistle. Well, that wasn't ominous at all. Jack shot him a look. "You knew something like this was going to happen." Kale shrugged. "I suspected. Didn't know it would get quite that dramatic." Veera ignored them both. She turned toward the carvings along the walls, her fingers tracing the glowing symbols. "The key to the end," she murmured. "The beginning of the storm." Jack frowned. "That doesn't sound like a great prophecy." Kale smirked. "Depends on who you ask." Veera's hands clenched into fists. Jack could see the frustration tightening her features. She wanted answers, and this had only given her more questions. Then suddenly, she staggered. Jack reacted instantly, moving to steady her. "Hey, you okay?" She gasped, her body trembling. Then her silver eyes glowed. Not the way they had before, not a soft shimmer. This was something else. Blinding, intense, power bleeding through. Then, a shockwave exploded outward from her. Jack barely had time to throw himself to the ground before the ruins around them shattered. Columns cracked, ancient stone crumbling beneath the force of whatever had just been unleashed. The pulse of energy knocked Cal clean off his feet, sending him skidding across the ground. And Veera. She stood in the center of it all, her body pulsing with silver light, completely unaware of what she had just done. Jack pushed himself up, coughing as dust filled his lungs. "Veera, She turned toward him, but she wasn't fully there. Her pupils were blown wide, her expression blank, like she was looking through him instead of at him. Jack felt his gut twist. Something was happening to her. He rushed forward, grabbing her shoulders. "Veera, snap out of it." The moment his hands touched her, the energy vanished. She gasped, her body collapsing against him, as if something had drained her completely. Jack caught her before she hit the ground, his heart hammering. Cale groaned from across the room. Well, that was new. Jack ignored him, focusing on Veera. Her breaths were shallow, but she was awake. Her fingers curled weakly against his sleeve. I didn't mean to do that," she whispered. Jack exhaled, brushing her damp hair away from her face. "Yeah, I figured." Cale staggered to his feet, rubbing his head. "So here's the fun part," he said. "That little explosion of power. Yeah, it probably didn't go unnoticed." Jack's stomach dropped. Veera's face paled. Cale dusted himself off. "Which means we need to move. Now." Jack didn't argue. He pulled Veera up, wrapping an arm around her to keep her steady. They had come looking for answers. Instead, they had woken something far worse. Jack didn't stop to think. He just moved. Veera was barely standing, her body drained from whatever power had just torn through the ruins. Jack could still feel the remnants of it in the air, a hum beneath his skin, a strange pull that sent chills down his spine. He didn't know what she had awakened, but he knew one thing for sure. They were in danger. Cale had already taken the lead, moving fast across the crumbling ruins. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something tighter, more serious. He didn't need to say it. They all felt it. Something was coming. Jack tightened his grip around Veera, supporting her as they followed. She was struggling to keep pace, her legs weak, her breaths shallow, but she wasn't complaining. He could tell she was trying to stay strong, even as whatever energy had surged through her threatened to pull her under. The ruins trembled again, this time with a different kind of force. Not from her, but from something outside. Jack barely had time to react before the sky split open. A deafening roar shook the ground, and above them, ships descended. Not the sleek, polished vessels of the palace guards. These were darker, heavier, war machines. Jack cursed. That was fast. Cale grimaced. Yeah, turns out when you accidentally unleash a power blast across an entire city, it tends to draw attention. Jack shot him a glare, but didn't have time to argue. The ships were landing. Dark figures dropped from their open hatches, armored soldiers moving in formation. Their weapons glowed with pulsing blue energy, locking onto the ruins. Jack recognized the insignia on their armor immediately. Not the palace guards. Not mercenaries. The elite guard of the High Council. His gut twisted. They weren't here to capture. They were here to eliminate. Veera gripped his sleeve. "We have to go," she whispered. Jack nodded. He scanned the ruins, looking for an escape route. They were too exposed, trapped between the collapsing temple and the advancing soldiers. Then Cale muttered, "Well, we could always go down." Jack followed his gaze. At first, he didn't see it. But then, the cracks in the ground. The stone floor Veera's power had shattered had opened something below. A dark tunnel leading into the depths of the ruins. Jack didn't hesitate. "Move." Cale jumped first, disappearing into the darkness. Jack turned to Veera. "Hold on to me." She nodded weakly, and he grabbed her tight before jumping into the abyss. The world flipped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but freefall, then impact. Jack hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the shock as Veera tumbled beside him. Above them, the sky was already filling with laser fire. They had gotten out just in time. Cale pulled himself up, brushing dust from his coat. "See, perfect landing." Jack groaned. "Shut up." Veera let out a weak laugh before trying to stand. Jack steadied her. "You good?" She swallowed hard. "I think so." But he wasn't convinced. He could feel the slight tremor in her frame, see the way her fingers still flickered with the last traces of energy. Whatever had happened up there, it wasn't over. Cale exhaled, glancing around. So bad news. We're trapped in an ancient underground labyrinth with no clear exit and probably some angry ghosts. Jack scowled. And the good news? Cale grinned. We're not dead yet. Jack rolled his eyes. Let's move. They followed the tunnel deeper. The air grew colder, the walls smoother, clearly not natural. This place had been built long ago, sealed away for a reason. And as they moved, the whispers started. At first, Jack thought he was imagining it. Faint murmurs, just at the edge of his hearing. But then he saw Veera stiffen. Cale, for once, looked unsettled. They all heard it. Jack exhaled. I really hate ruins. Then the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Jack's breath caught. He had seen a lot of things in his life, but this, it was a city. Not a ruin, not a temple. A hidden city stretching into the darkness, its structures glowing faintly with the same silver light that had flickered through Veera's veins. Massive stone towers rose like silent sentinels, their surfaces covered in the same glowing symbols they had seen before. Bridges arched across chasms, leading to places lost in the shadows. And in the center, a monument, a towering structure carved from obsidian, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat of light. Cale whistled low. Well, that's new. Jack felt a cold shiver down his spine. What the hell is this place? Veera stepped forward, her gaze locked on the monument. She knew. Jack could see it in her face. Something deep inside her recognized this place. Then the voice came again. She has returned. Jack turned sharply. The air shifted. Figures emerged from the shadows. Tall, cloaked beings, their faces hidden behind silver masks. They moved in complete silence, surrounding them in an instant. Jack's hands went to his weapon, but Veera raised a hand. Wait, she whispered. The figures halted. One of them stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was neither male nor female, just ancient. Princess of the Forgotten Line, you have come home. Veera's breath hitched. Who are you? The figure slowly lifted a hand, pointing to the monument at the center of the city. We are the last of those who remember. And you are the one who must awaken the past. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't like this. But Veera looked at the monument, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked whole. Cale exhaled. Well, this just got interesting. Jack sighed, rubbing his temple. This was only the beginning.